All right, we are live. First college basketball podcast of the season, start of the college basketball season, and the start of college basketball for Vincerix. Pretty much anybody who's following along here will probably have started out as a fan of some of the stuff we've been doing historically for golf, and college basketball has always been something that I've at least had high on the list of kind of next sports that we would do. And so that is what we're doing here. As you'll probably see if you're following along on my Twitter. I've actually been locked out of Twitter today in the effort to set up our Vincerix Hoops account. Hopefully get that squared away somewhat soon. But if you are a college hoops fan, follow at Vincerix_hoops. We're going to be talking a lot of college basketball there this season, as well as posting a lot of this content that we'll be doing on the college basketball side of things there. So if you are a college hoops fan, then follow along there. And that's probably the best place for if you've got something for Adam at the moment. For me, the best way to contact me until I get back into the DG betting account. Quick spiel there to get started, but want to give Hunter a chance to introduce himself. He's a new team member here at Vincerix. We actually went to college at the University of Washington together, and give him a chance to introduce himself. Big college hoops fan, and excited to be doing the podcast with him this year.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Hunter. Big college hoops fan my whole life. Grew up in Corvallis, Oregon, so I'm a Beaver. And then ended up going to school at the University of Washington. So big Dogs fan. As you can see, I got the Go Huskies behind me. Ran the Dog Pack Twitter account, claim to fame in college. So I got to do some stuff with the marketing department. And then after college, went and worked for Nike for a few years and then jumped to EA Sports before getting the opportunity to come join Vincerix. Super stoked about it. Super excited to be talking college ball all year with Adam. Think we should have a lot of good stuff in store for you guys this year.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of on that front, a couple things that we've got going, both, I guess, on the content side of things and then the actual data side of things. Really excited on the data side of things. We're going to have basketball stuff up on the site here. We'll release some stuff this week. And then over the next coming weeks, as we get a few games worth of data in for a lot of these teams, we're going to have rankings, matchups, all that kind of good stuff on the site, kind of inspired by, obviously, love KenPom and everything that he's done there, but trying to do something similar, but with a little bit more focus on the betting side of things. So if you've liked some of the stuff we've done historically with golf, then definitely be on the lookout here in the next few weeks as we release some stuff on the basketball front. Really excited to get that going. And then, yeah, on the content side of things, we'll be doing podcast pretty regularly, probably a couple times a week, if not a little bit more, depending on if there's, big games and things like that going on, as well as Hunter's already kicked off a few little season previews with some GAs and different people from different teams in the country. So hopefully throughout the year, we'll also be having some great guests on here from teams of all shapes and sizes. So had somebody from McNeese State on the to start off with, an exciting year there with Will Wade appearing down there in Louisiana, and then had a little Q&A with Dayton as well. So go to our Instagram at Vincerix there to see some of that content. And then, as you can see down at the bottom, Vincerix Hoops for Twitter, the YouTube at Vincerix, and then the podcast. All of these will be going up onto something like Spotify and hopefully Apple as well. Just search for Vincerix Hoops there. So that's the quick spiel to get things started. But let's just dive into it. The season kicks off today, opening day. A few interesting games, and we'll get to talk maybe a little bit about some of the games today towards the end here. But today's focus, really season preview, looking at futures, both on a national level as well as at the conference level. And then tomorrow night, we'll actually have Matt Gannon joining us to look more at the mid-major landscape. So today, a little bit higher level, a lot more of the national Power Five, I guess, conferences. And then we will dive deeper into the mid-major action tomorrow. And then, like I said, we'll have recurring podcasts going here. So we'll be covering all sorts of things as the season begins. But we'll start by kind of looking at the national landscape, looking at the futures to kind of serve as our rankings to kick off the season. Very interesting when we looked to last year, going into the season, of those teams that made the Final Four with UConn, San Diego State, Miami, and Florida Atlantic. San Diego State, the, I guess, lowest odds of those teams coming into the year at 6,600, 66-1 for San Diego State. UConn goes on to win the national championship starting the year at 80-1. But then we go back just a season before, much chalkier Final Four, teams like Kansas winning the national championship, Villanova, North Carolina, and Duke being in that Final Four, with none of those teams opening beyond 30-1 going into the season. So an interesting landscape going into the year after seeing, chalk the year before and probably chalk more historically last year, one of the most open seasons ever. It'll be interesting to see this year. And I guess maybe the first question to you, Hunter, looking at, we had chalk 2 years ago, last year, the really kicking off of just the craziness in the transfer portal. As you look to this season, do you think it's as open of a year as it was last year? Or maybe do we see, the cream rise to the top a little bit more from the Blue Bloods this year?
Yeah, I think there's two things that really stick out to that trend. I think the first was coming off the COVID year. You saw those teams, the Blue Bloods, that had acquired the most talent. Not as many kids were moving around. So you saw the Blue Bloods acquire the top talent, and then your Villanovas, your Dukes, your Kansases all make it to the Final Four. Move forward a year, move forward another year in the NIL progression. You start to see a lot more parity in college basketball. You look at a team like Miami, it was well talked about, the money that Wong and Nigel Pack got to go play at Miami. I think you're going to see more of that with NIL, just dispersing the talent around. You see a lot of teams now that are getting top recruits that might not be a top program. But, if you got the boosters and you have the support, you're going to be able to get some pretty solid guys and make some pretty deep runs in the tournament if you can put those pieces together.
Absolutely. And I think also kind of on the front of how the odds shaped out last year, just looking at, there was 4 teams coming into the season, at least the odds that I was looking at to start last season, that were below 10-1. So we had Kentucky, Gonzaga, Houston, and North Carolina under 10-1 odds to open the season. The best result of those teams being Gonzaga making it to the Elite Eight, but obviously none of those teams make the Final Four. North Carolina misses the tournament as the preseason number 1 and favorite in the odds at about plus 800 going into last season. This year, not a single team opens below 10-1 odds, at least using DraftKings odds here to talk about. The first team there being the AP number 1. KenPom has them as number 2. The Kansas Jayhawks with Hunter Dickinson transferring in from Michigan. How do you feel, I guess, about the Jayhawks entering this season? And do you think they're deserving as the both favorite and AP number 1 to start the season?
Yeah, I think when you look across the landscape, Kansas deserves to be there. They got Hunter Dickinson out of the portal, clear-cut number 1 guy that was in the portal. They're also bringing back that veteran leadership. They're bringing back McCullers, such an impactful player on the defensive end. And then when you just look at Kansas, 19, a share at least 19 of the last 24 conference championships. Bill Self has become an institution there. They bring back that veteran leadership that they had from last year. They add Hunter Dickinson. They have DeJuan Harris at point guard. They're a team that's been there. They're a team that knows what it takes to win at the highest level. So I like them first overall. I think you see a Duke second overall in the standings. Maybe a little flashier, bringing in a bunch of highlight freshmen, Filipowski coming back. But at the end of the day, we know that seniors and upperclassmen win in March. And that's what Kansas has this year. And the rankings show that. KenPom shows that this team's going to be the cream of the crop. And they have a target on their back for sure, especially in the Big 12 play.
Yeah, and I think when you look at Kansas as well, I even forgot about this doing some research today, that they go out in the second round of the tournament last year, but Bill Self, with that health issue last season in the tournament, unable to coach the team. And so you obviously hope that healthier year for Bill Self, but you get him, back at full strength and able to coach this team start to finish, and plenty to be optimistic about in Lawrence. And as we continue down here, you just mentioned Duke, second year for Jon Scheyer, also in the, making traction in the recruiting side of things as well, with a big commitment over the last couple of weeks. They returned Jeremy Roach, who I've always thought over the last couple of seasons has been one of the best guards in the country. You mentioned him briefly, but do you think this is a fair spot for Duke in a second year of Jon Scheyer? He takes the team to, I believe, 5th seed in the tournament last year. A great start. But lofty expectations on Duke with, not the historical pedigree that, Coach K would bring on a season-by-season basis. Do you think there's some of that built into this number, some of that historical success that, Scheyer's going to have to live up to this year? Or do you think this is fair based on what they bring to the table in 2023?
Yeah, I think the ranking is a bit of it's baked in, just being Duke, being that blue blood. They talk about the brotherhood all the time. Duke, again, just like Kansas, they're always going to be competitive. I don't think that they look at this program as taking a step back when going from Coach K to Scheyer. It seems like a pretty seamless transition. As far as if they're deserving to be the second overall team, I think that might be a little high. Just they're relying on, they have Roach, they have Filipowski, and they have Ryan Young coming back from last year. But they're bringing in 4 freshmen and Jared McCain, Sean Stewart, Caleb Foster, and TJ Power. And those guys are extremely talented, but I don't know. I'm going to need to see it on the floor before I go ahead and chalk them up as the second best team in the country. I think I'd look at a team like Purdue, even with the early exit last year in the tournament, bringing back a lot more players, bringing back Edey, bringing back Gillis, bringing back First. And then you look at their backcourt, Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer, just get another year of experience under their belt. I'd probably lean more so to a team like Purdue because of the experience that they have. But there's no doubt the ceiling at Duke. They have the ceiling to win it all. It's just going to be, can they put those pieces together?
Yeah, and I think when you look at Duke, you mentioned wanting to see it on the court from them before being able to, fully assess what we should be expecting from the Blue Devils this season, and we're going to get that. Just this Friday, Arizona heading to Cameron to play against Duke. Arizona, a team who makes some nice additions in the portal as well. An interesting one that we'll talk about in a minute. And then next Tuesday, neutral site matchup against Michigan State. And Michigan State, a team who, let's see what they are here in the preseason odds, will 1,500. And actually of these teams kind of at the top of the board, to me, they're one of the most interesting and probably who I would say I would slot into that number 2 spot behind Kansas, if not have them right up there, 1A and 1B with Kansas going into the season. You look at Izzo largely not using the portal at all, one of the, only high major Power 5 conference teams to not be using the portal aggressively in really any manner. But we saw that core group, that core group coming back last year, and they all return here for the large part in 2023, add in a top 5 recruiting class. And it's just it feels like the type of team, that Izzo kind of going against the rub of the grain, sticking up, building a program. They're going to bring experience. And then he goes out and kind of, it almost feels like the old fashioned way, takes this core and adds to it with a great freshman class coming in there. I think I saw them play last year in the Sweet 16 at Madison Square Garden against Kansas State, a game that they'll be kicking themselves coming into this season. That's a chance, a great opportunity there against Kansas State. That game goes to overtime, a thriller. They get a large chunk of that group back coming into this season. And I think obviously Izzo's success in March it doesn't need to even be talked about. For me, I've got them probably slotting in there behind Kansas. How do you feel about what the Spartans have going on this year up in East Lansing?
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head. I mean, how many times have we seen Izzo put together a team with senior guards that are going to make big shots come March? You get Hogard back, you get Tyson Walker back. I think Tyson Walker is one of those guys that he could be a top 5 player in the country. And even if he's not a top 5 player by metrics, when it comes down to the end of the game and you need a guy to go get you a bucket, he proved last year he can be that guy. Love Michigan State this year. I'm always a big Izzo guy, never going to bet against them. Totally agree with you. Could reason them into being 1A, 1B with Kansas. I think they should be an exciting team. I will just say, though, the Big Ten still is going to not get the benefit of the doubt. The Big Ten's been down the last couple of years, can't get a Final Four team since, I believe, 2019. So something to think about. I think there's been a lot going on in college basketball, though, between COVID, between the transfer portal, just figuring all that stuff out, that I definitely wouldn't be surprised to see the Spartans in Phoenix come March.
Yeah, and another team, we look at their non-conference schedule, a couple relatively simple opening games. James Madison, not a terrible mid-major to start off the year, but then, they play Duke next Tuesday. They'll play Arizona later in the year. I think that might be Maui Invitational. Is Michigan State? I think that's where they'll be for that Arizona game. And then Wisconsin to open up Big Ten play, and then they'll play Baylor before the end of the non-conference season. So solid enough test for Michigan State coming into the preseason here. And again, a team that I really like, kind of in the top of the board range. Another one who actually in the odds is just in front of Michigan State is John Calipari and Kentucky. Actually a reasonable amount of not necessarily a hot seat, but some pressure on Calipari and Kentucky to make a deeper run in the tournament than they have in recent years. seemingly going back to a very freshman heavy, some of that success that he's had previously with some of these elite classes. Just looking at 247's ranking of the top freshmen in the country coming in this year, 3 of the top 6 on this Kentucky roster. What do we expect in Lexington this year for Calipari and the Wildcats?
Yeah, a bit of turnover on the roster, as you said. You lose to Sheboy, Toppin, and Wallace, and Livingston all to the draft. But that's kind of been par for the course at Kentucky. They've lived off the one and dones. When you look at what Calipari's done with freshman guards, especially, seems like every team in the NBA now has a guy that played at Kentucky making big baskets for them. They do bring back Antonio Reeves. I think that's important. He's a catch and shoot guy, a guy that can kind of help these freshmen come along, because I think the ball is going to be in the hands of those younger guys a lot. DJ Wagner, Justin Edwards, Rob Dillingham. These guys are going to be asked to play huge roles, and they're going to be asked to perform early because they don't have the seniors to rely on, the upperclassmen to kind of ease them in. And I think one thing you talked about with Arizona and Michigan State on the schedules, I think it's great to see these blue bloods playing one another. The NCAA has done a good job rewarding, unlike football, they're rewarding the top teams for playing each other when it comes to the net, when it comes to quadrant 1 wins, when it comes to Selection Sunday. You want to go out and try to chase those opportunities to get those big wins. And Kentucky's going to have plenty of those early on, and they're going to have plenty of those because of SEC play. There's a lot of top teams there as well. I think maybe a little high, plus 1,400 or plus 1,400. Yeah. I don't think it'd be where I put my money. But again, I'm a guy that likes those seniors in March, I like the upperclassmen. So Kentucky's never really going to be my taste.
Yeah, for sure. And as you mentioned, that non-conference schedule to take on Kansas next Tuesday. So a very early litmus test for this young Kentucky team against what we were just saying, the kind of consensus #1 team in the country coming into the year. And also that Michigan State Arizona game, not the Maui Invitational, just a one-off event, but that'll be on Thanksgiving Day. So a tasty little treat there to go along with some football on Thanksgiving. Moving along, we get now down to a couple Big East teams, and I think the obvious one that we have to talk about first, the defending national champions at the University of Connecticut, the Huskies, 1,600. That makes them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, the 6th ranked team in the odds here. Ken Palm has UConn at number 4 coming into the season. Turnover there on the roster as well, but also some great pieces coming back for a team that surprised to go on to win the national championship last year. What are your thoughts of what is going on up there in Storrs, and whether this is too much of what happened last year is baked into this number, or maybe is there some value on UConn now sitting as the 6th in the odds coming into the season, coming off that national championship?
Yeah, I think it might be a little high. And the other reason I say that is because I think the Big East is going to be so strong this year that it's just going to be a bloodbath, and these teams are going to beat up on one another. And that doesn't mean that we can't see a team come out of it and make a deep run at a national championship. But I think even if you were to wait, you could probably get better odds than plus 16 on UConn, only because I think they're going to take some losses. You mentioned that turnover. They do lose Jackson to the draft. They lose Sonogo. There's a lot of talk coming in about Klingon. He's definitely an NBA guy, but he's a bit beat up coming into the season. But then the thing with college basketball is it comes down to your guard play. And I definitely wouldn't bet against Dan Hurley to figure it out. I think what he's building up there at UConn, for some reason, Storrs, Connecticut is just a honey hole in a place that you can win national championships. And it's hard to believe when you look at kind of the athletic program, what they've been able to do. But yeah, at 6th nationally, it seems a little high. It seems like a little too much hype. And also, I'd just say, when was the last team that won it and came back? It's really hard to repeat success in college basketball. And a lot of the reason that they had that success were those key pieces that they lost. So they're bringing in a bunch of talent again, but it's going to take some time to mesh.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And I was actually reading a kind of interview with Dan Hurley a couple days ago, just kind of talking about the expectations and what that means for them, and also just his mindset being a coach, winning his first national championship, coming from Rhode Island, or starting at Wagner and working his way through Rhode Island up to Connecticut. And they really had done, a couple of first round appearances in the NCAA tournament, hadn't really done anything. They win the national championship. So pressure and a new experience for sure for him as well. And what he was kind of saying in this interview is he's leaned upon both his dad, who's a very successful high school coach, talked to his brother, and then also just leaned on a lot of other successful coaches. He listed off a myriad of national champion coaches that he just kind of reached out to the offseason to said, like, how do you deal with this new level of expectation and pressure? So I think that's a piece as well. Obviously, Dan Hurley, a fantastic coach and now national champion as well, which there's just simply not a lot of coaches in the country that can say that. So you've got to have nothing but respect for what he did at that winning the national championship. But at the same time, this is a new experience for him as well. You combine that with kind of the turnover in the roster, and it will be an interesting year to see what UConn brings to the table. But like you said, I think looking over the last few years at teams that have won national championships and whether they came back and were legitimate contenders in the following year, you'd probably put UConn somewhere in the middle of maybe the teams that have won a national championship in the last 10 years and how they came back. And obviously it's teams having a ton of success off national championship are, relatively few and far between over that period. So totally agree there. And as we move down, and we'll talk about a good chunk of these teams a little bit further, because we're going to talk about this on a conference level here in a minute. But I guess moving now into those teams kind of in the 18 to 20 to 1 or above range, maybe 20, 30 to 1, kind of this next tier outside of those teams that initially come to mind as the top teams coming into the season. Who in this range, again, maybe Marquette's the next team there at about 1800, 18 to 1, up to maybe the 30 to 1s. When you look there, maybe what's a team or two that you think there might be some value on or is interesting in this kind of mid-tier range?
Yeah, I think a team that jumps out to me, 25 to 1 is Alabama. Nate Oates has turned Alabama into more than just a football school. That is one of the toughest places in the country to go play a game. They have an insane home court advantage. And then they added Grant Nelson, who's a guy I don't know if a lot of people know about, but a 7-footer out of North Dakota State. If you haven't seen this kid, you've got to check him out. He's appointment television, 7-footer that can handle the rock, shoot it from deep, and had some of the best posters in the country last season. So he's going to be fun to watch. And yeah, Alabama, they're going to compete for an SEC championship. They're going to play that up-tempo style of basketball, the 3-and-D. They're going to get up and down the floor. Come March, that's a good style of basketball to be playing. So I think there's some value there. Another team I'd look at is Creighton, again, 25 to 1. They lose Nembhard to Gonzaga, but they do bring a lot back. Kalkbrenner, one of the most efficient players in the country. Bailey Shireman, kid that's been in college basketball for quite a while now, a big shot maker. And then you just look at the program. It's been trending in the right direction. They're building something. They're really building something there. And then coming out of the Big East, they're going to have an opportunity for a bunch of quad 1 wins, and quad 1 wins can get you high up on the seed line. Being high up on the seed line get you favorable matchups. So I think a team to look at would definitely be Creighton in that range you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And one that I kind of had highlighted, they come off last year again as the favorite. They missed the NCAA tournament, a disastrous year in year 2 for Hubert Davis at North Carolina. But I think this year, 30 to 1 for them coming into the season. And I think when you look at what went wrong for North Carolina last year, kind of just looking deeper into the stats for them, on the defensive end and with Bacot coming back, they did a lot of the same things well that they did the year before. They rebounded the ball really well on both the offensive and defensive glass, but they went from 87th in the country in assist percentage in 2022 to 310th in the country in assist percentage in 2023. So just a lack of cohesion with a lot of the same players coming back. It's interesting, obviously concerning to see that take place. But this year we have Love heading to Arizona now, so he's gone. But you get RJ Davis back and a freshman who seems highly touted and interesting, in Elliot Cadeau coming in at North Carolina to play point guard, a pass first type of player, and potentially just looking at that from a statistical perspective of the huge area of weakness for North Carolina last year, clearly one of the weakest points for them, as well as 3-point shooting, those two areas. And I think you bring in a player who might be able to plug right into that hole. And then you look at a team that just the year before played for a national championship, and they still have a reasonable number of those pieces. So another it's a little bit high risk, high reward with North Carolina, but they were number one in the country coming in last year, roughly 8-1 in the odds. They fall back to 30-1 this year, bringing in a piece that plugs in nicely to fill one of those gaps or big holes that hurt them last year. I think North Carolina is one that I find interesting kind of in this mid-range, and they'll be interesting as well, just with the ACC maybe not being as strong as it has been historically. It wasn't as strong last year, may not be again this year. Duke obviously looking tough, but then Duke, North Carolina, you can sometimes just throw out the rankings and throw out what it means going into those games. If North Carolina can be high up in the ACC, second, third, fourth, going into some of those games with Duke, might be able to pick up a win or two there and build some momentum going into the tournament. So I like North Carolina this year.
Yeah, I like North Carolina as well. The team also adds Harrison Ingram and Cormac Ryan from Stanford. Harrison Ingram, a guy that came into Stanford, some thought he was going to be a one and done. Didn't flash the way that people had expected, but if you actually watch those games, there are a lot of plays that Harrison Ingram makes that you can see why he's an NBA level guy. So getting those two guys to come over and have that experience in college basketball, I think is big. And then I think you made a great point about the assist or lack there situation at UNC. There was a lot of my turn, your turn ball going on last year. And the Roy Williams and Hubie style of game, they get up and down the floor, they take quick shots. So it's a double-edged sword. It didn't work out for him last year, but I think getting some more experienced guys coming in, maybe they can take better shots this year, play through Baycott a little bit more, touch the paint on more possessions, get some more open threes. So yeah, I like 30-1. I mean, anytime you can get 30-1 on a UNC, gotta like those odds. No one wants to see UNC come March.
No, and that's the thing. Like I was saying, kind of even with that matchup against Duke that might come later in the season, it's very possible that North Carolina spends a lot of this season, not as a top 10, top 5 team in the country. They enter, KenPom has them 17 to start the year. They could be in that range for much of the season. But again, you move towards March, you move to that time of the year. Blue blood like North Carolina, Hubert Davis has shown the ability to lead a team to a national final just a season before last. So an interesting one, and definitely a team to watch here early in the season. Let's see who they've got in the non-conference. Tennessee, they'll play UConn, they'll play Kentucky. So we're going to get a good feel for North Carolina by the middle point of December.
Yeah, and I think just one last thing to hit on with them. And I was fortunate I was able to go to the Final Four in New Orleans when UNC played. One thing you can't overlook with college basketball, and I like these blue bloods, it's the fan bases that travel, and they can turn a neutral court into a home game pretty quickly and get momentum. And I just think that's huge come March Madness. It means something being a blue blood, having your fans travel. So again, even if they can get in as an 8 seed, you beat the 1, all of a sudden you're on the 1 line. So.
Yeah, and I think what you're mentioning there too of the blue bloods, it was something I was looking at, just doing some research, and sometimes you forget who's won the recent, national championship 5-6 years ago. You just look through the list of teams that have won the national championship going back almost 20 years here. And yeah, there's, fun Cinderella runs. There's been long shot teams that have made it to, or in long shot in the sense of not a blue blood, that have made it to the national championship. Obviously San Diego State last year, a team like Texas Tech a few years ago, not necessarily one that, jumps out as a top, contender in college basketball, but you just read through the teams. UConn, Kansas, Baylor, maybe one who doesn't necessarily have the pedigree, but again, a team that's been great in the Big 12 and plays in one of the toughest conferences in college basketball. Virginia, maybe in the same boat as Baylor, another team that maybe doesn't have the awesome pedigree of a blue blood, but has just played well under Tony Bennett for so long. So not a surprise to see them win a national championship. But then Villanova, North Carolina, Villanova, Duke, UConn, Louisville, Kentucky, UConn, Duke. You just go back and on and on. And we'll spend a lot of this year and a lot of the previews talking about whether it's mid-majors or longer shots or these teams that may be able to make a run come March. You just look at the teams that go on to win a national championship, and I think it ties into exactly what you said there. You just can't discount what it means to have the pedigree in college basketball. So with that, we kind of move past any of these teams, I guess, before we kind of talk about maybe some longer shots that could be interesting. Any of these teams in the UCLA, Villanova, Gonzaga, Texas, Maryland range, FAU, Baylor, any of those teams interesting to you? I think Baylor was maybe one that you are high on coming into the season.
Yeah, I mean, Baylor at 35-1. I just love Scott Drew. I love what he does with the program. He's always going to be competitive. They got a freshman coming in who is where is he?
Yeah, I saw him. Let's see, Baylor. Yeah, he's the number 8 recruit in the country, a 6'5" shooting guard. out of McKinney, Texas, Jacoby Walter.
Yep.
Heading down
Same size and build, same play style as Keontae George from last year. So got some talent coming in. They do lose LJ Cryer to Baylor, but they got Jalen Bridges coming back. And again, they're in the Big 12, and Scott Drew is going to be competing for a Big 12 championship year in and year out. So you can get them at 35-1. Again, going to have the opportunity to get a bunch of quad one wins in conference and can play their way onto a pretty sweet seed line. Other teams, I think you got to look at Gonzaga. This feels like the year that no one's talking about Gonzaga. So just for that reason alone, I think they're a team to look at. St. Mary's was actually picked in the coaches poll to win the WCC. That feels crazy to me. I think it's Gonzaga's conference every single year until proven otherwise. They got a guy, Graham Ike, coming in from Wyoming, who's really good in the middle. They lose Timmy, but if you never saw this guy play at Wyoming, I'm telling you, this guy's a double-double machine. They got Nolan Hickman coming back at point guard. They got Anton Watson coming back. They get Steel Venters coming over from Eastern Washington, a sharpshooter. And again, Gonzaga hasn't won it, but every single year they're knocking on the door. And just the fact that no one's talking about them this year, I think you can get some pretty good value because, they run through the WCC. They win a couple of these non-conference games. They're going to be on a high seed line. They're going to be right where they're used to being.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about Gonzaga, obviously both of us being Washington graduates, I personally root against Gonzaga about as hard as I root against any team in the country in any sport. So anything I say about Gonzaga for the rest of the year, I'm getting that out ahead of time. I root hard against Mark Few and Gonzaga, but at the same time, obviously respect what they do there in Spokane. And as somebody who's grown up in Washington, been to Spokane numerous times, if you've never been to Spokane, it's hard to fathom what Gonzaga does on a national level from a city of Spokane. And like you said, nobody talking about him this year. Ken Palm starts them 5th, gives them the number 1 offensive rating in the country coming into the season. Obviously, a lot of last year baked in there, but he does make adjustments of teams coming into the year, and for them to be ranked 5th and maybe not getting respect both in the national polls as well as even in the odds within the WCC itself. I'm definitely afraid of Gonzaga. As somebody who never wants Gonzaga to succeed or ever win a national championship, I can say that the lack of hype about them actually has me more concerned about them than maybe I would in a season where they come in, as a top 5 team in the country or whatever it may be. You look at their non-conference schedule, and actually maybe not as difficult of a non-conference schedule for Gonzaga. And again, that ties in to what we've been talking about with the pedigree and the coaches. Mark Few likely looking at a team that needs a little bit more time, needs some cohesion potentially to gel. A lot of moving parts. You lose Drew Timme and the lock in the center that he's been for them over the last couple seasons. And yes, they're going to play Purdue on Monday, November 20th. So they're going to get a battle against one of the top teams in the country. But then outside of that, they play USC. They'll play our Washington Huskies, which will likely be relatively straightforward for Gonzaga, unfortunately. And then they're going to play UConn. I believe that's in Seattle, which will be a good matchup for them. So they do have some of those top-level teams that are going to play in the non-conference. They'll also play San Diego State. But for me, at least, just looking at that Gonzaga schedule, seems a little bit lighter potentially than maybe what they have played over the last few years when they came in as one of the top-ranked teams in the country.
Yeah, I'll definitely. Especially that game against UConn in Seattle. Gonzaga fans take over Seattle whenever they play at UW. They're going to take over that game. If they're a sizable underdog in that game, or even just I'll probably be looking at them on the money line that game. I think it'll be a good litmus test. And again, a lot of people not talking about Gonzaga, but maybe it's just because we're from the Northwest and we're Huskies and we know what that program does to us. But they're going to be competitive, and Mark Few is always going to have them ready to go.
Yeah, and actually, as I look at this, there's so many different conference tournaments that come on these days. They will be down there in Maui for the Maui Invitational, so a chance there to face some additional tough opponents. That is where that Purdue game will be taking place there in Maui, I do believe. Yeah. So that'll be interesting to watch. The other teams just down there in Maui, since we've talked about it a couple times and I haven't nailed the teams. Let's just list off who's going to be down there for the Maui Invitational. Kansas will be there. Marquette will be there. Purdue, I believe that's Stanford, Texas, and UCLA, of course, not taking place, unfortunately, in Maui due to the tragedy that happened there earlier this year. So thoughts out to them at this time of year. And hopefully with the Maui Invitational being one of the marquee events for that area, hopefully draws some attention and support to that area as well with what happened there earlier this year. A couple of teams outside of maybe 50-1 that I was looking at, again, just interested in this range after last year. We saw so many long shot teams make the Final Four. Now, with that being said, I'm a big golf bettor. When you compare maybe the college basketball futures odds to something like golf futures odds, there's going to be a really good chance that you're going to get some great numbers on teams, even all the way to March Madness. You look at some of the odds on the teams that even made the Final Four last year, just up before March Madness even started. The odds were still fantastic for those teams who ended up making a run. So not necessarily a sport or something where I'm, jonesing to place a lot of long shot bets before the season, but fun to talk about just because, honestly, so that if one of these teams does well, we can clip it and celebrate. But a few teams that jumped out to me, first one being Kansas State. Just when you look at what they did last year, make that run to the Elite Eight, and then kind of they're following a similar model to what they did last year. They brought in transfers in Noel and Johnson last year that were kind of the core of that team. Obviously, Noel played phenomenally all season and then truly unbelievable in March Madness. Like I said, saw them play against Michigan State in that Sweet 16 game at MSG, and he was a electric factory to say the least. But then they come back this year. They add Tyler Perry from North Texas, who is the Conference USA Player of the Year, a good scorer. You slot him into that point guard slot. And then they add Arthur Kaluma, a player from Creighton, who, for me, actually looking at Creighton this year, I think that's a huge loss for them. I've always liked him at Creighton. I thought he was a great kind of go-to player on both ends of the floor. He goes to Kansas State. Obviously, they've got something good going there based on that run they made last season. I don't see any reason why we should assume Kansas State doesn't have what it takes to compete at the top of the Big 12 again this season. How do you feel about Kansas State going into the year?
Yeah, I think you make a good point, and you called out the two key guys, Tyler Perry, the Conference USA Player of the Year at North Texas. Helped get McCaslin the job at Texas Tech. Ultimately, he's coming over. And just when you look at it, if you take a step back a year ago and you look at Tyler Perry coming in versus Marquise Noel coming in, Tyler Perry would have had more hype. There would have been more excitement about him. And then you look at Arthur Kaluma, a huge loss for Creighton. And I still like the Blue Jays this year, but he's one of those guys that has the NBA skill set and the NBA flashes where he can make plays on the floor that other guys just aren't able to make. And Kansas State plays a fun brand of basketball. They get up and down. So that athleticism, I think, is going to be on full display. And, you even look at them, they open the season tonight, 2.5-point underdogs to a USC team. So you can get some pretty good odds on Kansas State if you believe that Jerome Tang can bring those pieces together. But, that's going to be a difficult ask. And just because you can do it one year doesn't mean you can do it the next. It's a different group of players. Also, Naquan Tomlin is suspended indefinitely, so a bit of a loss there. But yeah, I like them. And then another team I like in the Big 12 in the same vein, I like TCU, a team that uses the transfer portal to reload. They get Jameer Nelson Jr. from Delaware, a guy that averaged 24-4. Probably one of the most exciting guys to get out of the portal. They actually get Avery Anderson coming over from Oklahoma State. They get SM Mustafa coming from Coastal Carolina, kid that led the Sun Belt in double-doubles. And then they bring back a lot of talent as well. They bring back Micah Peavy. They bring back Charles O'Bannon. They bring back Emmanuel Miller. Jacoby Cole's coming back as well. So they have a lot of pieces, and Jamie Dixon's proved that he can build a winning program wherever he goes. So just like Kansas State, I think TCU, another Big 12 team to look at. You can finish a game or two under 500 in the Big 12 and still get an invite to the dance. And all you need is a ticket in to have a chance and have a live dog. So I definitely look at TCU as well there.
Yeah, and then one team just at like extended odds, 150-1, that I was just looking through kind of statistically last year, teams that maybe fit the mold of a team that could make a run this year, is Mississippi State in, I think, the second year under Chris Jans, who obviously was a tremendous coach at New Mexico State before coming over to Mississippi State. Tolu Smith is injured. He won't be back until conference play for them, a player who potentially an SEC kind of first team player, potentially player of the year candidate when healthy. They get him back. They make it to the first four last year, I believe, losing to Pitt in that opening game of the first four. But a team, they'll be in the SEC. Obviously, the SEC is going to be competitive. There's going to be a lot of bids available, I think, out of the SEC this year. And when you're talking about teams, you can go 500, maybe slightly below. I think if you can go 500 in the SEC this year, pick up potentially a couple quad one wins, they're going to be available almost half the games probably you play in the SEC. You're playing Alabama, you're playing Tennessee, you're playing Arkansas. There's going to be wins available. And you look at a team that's just defensively one of the best teams in the country. I'm interested in what Mississippi State will bring to the table this year. And I think it's exciting to see a coach who succeeded at the mid-major level. Obviously, it was a consistent force there. Comes up now to the SEC level, makes it to, I guess, the cusp, technically in the tournament, but the cusp of the tournament, losing in the first four, brings back a lot of good players and has clearly brought that defensive tenacity to Mississippi State. So a team that I think is interesting in the SEC as well.
Yeah, looking at Chris Jans, I love that hire. His success at New Mexico State, coming over to Mississippi State. You know, it's not an exciting brand of basketball. It's a defensive brand of basketball, and they're going to grind you for 40 minutes. But we've seen that work, and we've seen teams make deep runs. You think of a Texas Tech with Chris Beard. You think of what Virginia does. You know, they want to play games in the 60s. They want to win games on the defensive end, and they just want to give themselves a chance to make some shots down the stretch. So I love that at 150-1. Yeah, there's going to be opportunities to get those quad one wins in the SEC, and Chris Jans is a heck of a ball coach.
Yeah, and I think when you look at some of these longer shot teams, maybe you want to sprinkle a team or two at extended odds just to have a team to follow. Maybe you don't have a college that is good, or you didn't go to college that plays Division I basketball, whatever it may be, and you want to have a team maybe to lean onto a long shot. What I would do is you got to look for a team that's either going to excel defensively or offensively near the top of the country, and that's why I look at a team like Mississippi State. Ken Pom has them 8th defensively coming into the season. You need one of those pillars on either side of the court to kind of build upon. So if you're looking for one of those longer shot teams, maybe look for a team that over the last couple seasons has been, excessively skilled on the offensive end, on the defensive end, because you can, when you get to March, you've got that brand of basketball. You know what you do. You excel there. You can build on top of that and make a run. So again, that's why I think there's some interesting numbers there above 100-1. And like I said, just last year, we saw 2 teams that were beyond 100-1 to start the season, ultimately making the Final Four.
Yeah.
So that's a quick run through, I think, of kind of the national level of the odds to ultimately win the national championship. Now kind of diving in on a conference by conference level, a lot of exciting things across the nation here. We'll look again at some of the bigger conferences today, the Big East, the Big 12, the Big 10, the ACC, the SEC, and the Pac-12. We start with, we're both based here in New York City, our hometown conference at this point, the Big East. They bring the national champions back from UConn. Obviously, Villanova with the national championships in 2016 and 2018. Historically, one of the best conferences in the country, and they come in this year with multiple teams ranked in the top 10 to start the year. I know we've touched on a couple of them, but maybe just give a high-level overview of what we should expect in the Big East this year in what should be one of the most compelling conferences in the country, if not the most compelling conference in the country.
Yeah, there's so many storylines, and even just top to bottom, you look at the top of the conference, you look at the UConn, you look at the Marquette, Villanova a little lower than normal, but it's going to be an absolute war. There's Tyler Kolek at Marquette, preseason All-American, UConn coming back to defend the national championship. But I think what's fun about the Big East this year, and a storyline that I think more people should be talking about, of course, there's the Rick Pitino to St. John storyline, but how about Ed Cooley leaving Providence to go to Georgetown? A pretty wild move. Georgetown's been down for a while now, and he really had sustained success at Providence. Felt like you could just Sharpie Providence into the second round of the tournament with him there. But what does that say about Georgetown, and what does that say about the ceiling that he thinks he can take that program? And just, I can't wait for him to head back and play Providence this year. I mean, that is going to be one hostile environment, and the Friar faithful definitely had some things to say about Cooley taking that job.
Yeah, 100%. I think, again, just sticking with the storylines in this conference, for me, one of the most interesting things is just with something like Ed Cooley going to Georgetown, we add Rick Pitino at St. John's. Obviously, the top of the conference on almost a year in and year out basis is competitive at a national level, and you've got a team or two that can compete for a national championship on a yearly basis out of the Big East over the last half dozen years. But now we're talking about even those teams at the middle to bottom of the conference bringing in elite level coaches. Rick Pitino, obviously, you could spend forever talking about his career, but simply one of the most successful college basketball coaches of all time. You take him to St. John's. They're projected around 5th in the conference. You got Georgetown, probably even Ed Cooley himself, spoken about it's going to take a little bit of time to rebuild Georgetown into potentially the powerhouse that it was before. But as you mentioned, that he has to be excited about what's going on there to kind of give up a regular appearance in the NCAA tournament and a seemingly job for as long as he would probably want it at Providence to go down to Georgetown. So we're talking about a conference now that almost every single game, I mean, even Butler, who hasn't been good, Thad Matta's there. It's almost you forget that he's coaching at Butler now. DePaul probably the only true, I guess, doormat or seller in the conference. You've got 10 teams with legitimate coaches, and you just don't really see that elsewhere in the nation.
Yeah, and I mean, how good is the Big East that I didn't even mention? Sean Miller, Xavier, and I forgot to mention Marquette. This conference top to bottom is going to be an absolute war this year. One team I do think is a bit underrated is Xavier. Just going back to being a West Coast hoops fan, those Arizona teams, Sean Miller is always going to have a competitive team. And you look at what he did last year, they had a team that made a little bit of a tournament run. So I think there's some value if you want to sprinkle Xavier in the Big East. I think they could be an interesting team to look at. One team I think might be a bit overrated is Villanova. Kyle Neptune taking over for Jay Wright. They have Cam Whitmore, a top 5 prospect, ends up falling in the draft at number 20 because of his play at Villanova last year. They missed the tournament. What do they look like in year 2 under Kyle Neptune? They're coming in preseason ranked top 25. I know they're getting Justin Moore back. I know they have Archie Diacono back. They have some guys, but I'm going to need to see it to believe it from Kyle Neptune because he came over from Fordham and year 1 was just not a success by any stretch of the imagination and not what Villanova basketball has come to expect.
Yeah, and I think commenting on both of those points, you look at Xavier, I'm seeing him at 30-1 to win the Big East, and obviously a long shot number for a team that is a long shot to win the Big East. But we just looked last year, Marquette was not considered one of the main contenders in the Big East and was right there at the top of the conference last year. So due to the depth of the conference, due again to the depth of the coaching in the conference, if you're looking at a conference for maybe one of those teams at longer odds that could legitimately challenge for a conference title, I think you can look at the Big East because, the top of the conference is legit. It's, tough to surpass some of these top 10 teams there. But when you look to those mid tiers, they've got the quality coaching to excel. And then just talking about Villanova, Jay Wright at Villanova was my favorite coach in the country just over the last, his almost entire career at Villanova, just seeing how he took a team that early in his career was successful, kind of rebuilt almost entirely their approach. You just look statistically at what Jay Wright did at Villanova from some of those early teams to the teams that ended up winning the national championship. You can just, love to see that progression from a coach over his career. Obviously, he steps aside, as you've mentioned, tough year last year and year 1 without Jay Wright for Villanova. But what I thought was interesting, just today, I saw that he was at practice talking to the coaches and players over the last couple of days. Possible, that he gets a little bit more connected to the program. I don't know, again, what he was doing last year or what he wasn't doing, but just knowing the pride that he has for Villanova and the pride that Villanova has for that team, potential that, Jay Wright maybe gets a little bit more of a voice in the ear of the staff there. And that, to me, if I was looking for a reason why maybe Villanova could improve, if the possibility that maybe Jay Wright gets a little bit more involved after seeing what happened last year. Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah, and it's not a team that I'd bet against by any stretch of the imagination. I just think when I look at where I'd put my money across the Big East teams, Villanova's not there because, again, we talk about how important college coaching is in college basketball, and you look at how many proven coaches there are in the Big East. Villanova just doesn't have that. Yep. But again, Villanova goes out and competes for a Big East championship. No one's going to be surprised that they're there. And they do have that experience coming back, especially with Justin Moore. But yeah, just looking at where I'd place my bets early on wouldn't be my pick. But if it's a place of interest, it makes sense. You can see the storylines there with Jay Wright getting more involved, and it's Villanova
Yeah.
basketball at the end of the day.
And I think what you just said there is an interesting point, especially for people that maybe don't follow college basketball super closely. When you think of Villanova, you think of the Big East, you've just forever penciled them in it as one of those super well, you knew what Villanova basketball was going to be on a season by season basis. And you simply can't say that right now for Villanova. So totally agree there. And it is interesting listing off these coaches that, now they're probably near the bottom of the conference just from pedigree of coach. And a team, not one that maybe we should have high expectations from, but just one that we didn't even mention, another up and coming, potentially great coach in Shaheen Holloway at Seton Hall, year 2 there after taking St. Peter's, of course, on that deep run in the NCAA tournament. Not a great opening year for him at Seton Hall, but just again, a team we haven't even talked about to this point that has one of the most up and coming and well sought after coaches in the country over the last couple of years there in a second year from him, and a team that might be interesting as well.
Yeah, just again speaks to the depth of the conference. I mean, Shaheen Holloway was, the fan favorite. What he did with St. Peter's, taking over at Seton Hall. There was a lot of excitement there. Year 1 didn't go, I think. It's still an impressive year for Seton Hall. And just seeing what he can do in year 2, again, they go ahead and make the dance. They make some noise. I don't think anyone should be surprised.
Yeah, 17-16 last year at Seton Hall. Took over a team that was 21-11 the year before. But yeah, kind of wasn't bad, wasn't great, but he gets a second year. It takes some time sometimes in year 2. An interesting opportunity for Seton Hall. They're going to bring it on the defensive end of the floor, certainly, and they're not going to be a team that's going to be easy to. There's no real easy team again besides maybe DePaul and still year 1 for Georgetown, but that's going to be a team where I wouldn't be surprised if you see Seton Hall with some meaningful victories in the conference. And in fact, you just look at them last year; they beat UConn in January at home there in New Jersey. So again, just the depth of the Big East. And one team we touched on briefly, and I kind of want to talk for a few more minutes about him, is Creighton. Creighton on the cusp of the Final Four last year. Maybe a questionable call in that game that keeps them from going to the Final Four. A team that now on almost a yearly basis, no matter who's there, has been fantastic, but there has been some turnover there, specifically at the point guard position. We talked about Gonzaga a little bit earlier with Nembhard now going from Creighton to Gonzaga. Maybe diving a little bit deeper, how do you feel about what Creighton brings to the table, and do you think they're maybe over underrated, listed here at 3-1 to win the Big East?
Yeah, I think it's a fair number because everything you talked about, Creighton is going to be competing for the Big East championship this year. They bring in Stephen Ashworth from Utah State, who's a great player to replace Nembhard at point guard. They have Bailey Shireman, who can knock shots down. He's been there. It'll be now year 2 or year 3 in the system. He was a transfer. And then Kalkbrenner is really the difference maker for them. The 7-footer, the rim runner, one of the most efficient guys in the country. And a big thing for me is he can make his free throws as well. And that's what makes this Creighton team so hard to defend, is they can stretch you outside the 3-point line. And then they've got a 7-footer going towards the rack who will punish you if you foul him. So I think Creighton at 3-1 is fair. I think they're going to be right there competing. I don't know if it's the best place to put your money just because of the value, but I think it's a fair price.
Yeah, totally. And you look at their non-conference schedule, they're they play some mid-level teams throughout November and into December, but they'll be not quite playing as tough of a non-conference schedule as maybe some of these other top teams that we've mentioned so far. They will play Alabama in December, and then they kick off Big East play with games against Villanova and Marquette. So again, it's similar, I guess, for the Big East, maybe to more of like a football type of schedule where you're going to get all of those top matchups during the regular season. I'm sure you'd love to pick up some quad one or some meaningful wins in the non-conference, but maybe not as big of a requirement as in some other conferences. And just one other topic, I mentioned this to you earlier. This is probably of the hot takes on the pod. This will be up there. I love what Shaka Smart does as a coach. I love him as a person, and I think he's had a lot of success in the regular season. But I tend to believe that Marquette and Shaka Smart specifically, it was 2011 when VCU made that first Shaka Smart run to the Final Four, and obviously that catapults him onto the national scene, and we've known of Shaka Smart ever since then. But we just go through season by season since then, and we do not have Shaka Smart advancing past the second round of the NCAA tournament since that run to the Final Four. To me, That's concerning. I think there's been specifically some of those Texas teams with disappointing first round exits in the tournament. He did not make it to the second round of the NCAA tournament at Texas. Does make it into the second round last year before falling. I know the expectations are obviously sky high for Marquette this year. What do you think when you just look at that? And obviously the goal of March Madness a lot of times is just keep making it, because there's a lot of different things that can happen, and the goal is just to be there every year. And to Shaka's credit, he has appeared in the NCAA tournament a myriad of times. But for me, that's something maybe just doesn't get talked about enough, and is a little bit of a red flag for me, at least with my hopes for Marquette. Maybe not in the Big East, where they definitely can win the conference title, but for them to be a true national championship contender versus some of these other teams, I don't necessarily see it with Marquette.
Yeah, and Marquette just goes to show how we evaluate college basketball, because UConn goes on to win. Everyone agrees they're the best team in the country. People forget that Marquette won the conference regular season and won the conference tournament last year. Going into March Madness, Marquette was one of the favorites to make a deep run, make it to the Final Four, and they end up getting bounced. I do think, Shaka in March, it's one of those coaches that everyone likes to talk about, Shaka Smart in March. Well, it's been a long time since he made that run at VCU, to your point. Do I think it speaks to him being not as good of a coach as others say? I don't know. There's so much parity in college basketball, and it's so hard to advance to the second weekend. You win that first game, you have to turn around. You have 48 hours to go and beat your second opponent. Maybe you can point to being outcoached by other guys that have that short turnaround. It's definitely a concern. I mean, just as a fan, I used to have Shaka making a deep run. I learned my lesson. I got burnt. I had Texas winning the championship, actually, when they lost to Abilene Christian. So I've been on the Shaka in March train. I'm firmly off the Shaka in March train. But again, I don't think that takes away from what Marquette can do this year in the regular season. Marquette's got a great home court advantage. Shaka Smart gets those guys playing hard every single game. I don't know. I've just been burned too many times by him at this point that, I'll probably have him bounce in the first or second round and they'll make the Final Four, because that's just how it goes. But I tend to agree with you there that it's a bit concerning, his track record in March.
Yeah, and I guess having talked about most of these teams, maybe taking the odds out of it, who is your pick to win the Big East this year? Just one team.
I'll take Creighton. I like what they bring back. I think that, I think they're fairly priced at 3-1. Would I take them to make the deepest run in the tournament? No, but over the course of a Big East season, I definitely think they can win the conference this year.
Yeah, and I think I've actually, again, taken the odds out of it because I think they are priced to perfection. If I just had to pick one team, it may be simple, but I'm going to go back to last year's national champions, and I'm going to trust UConn with what they've got coming back, and Dan Hurley and just the level of coach that he is. I think that, and he talked about this in this interview that I mentioned earlier, using almost some of that not being picked to win the Big East. They asked him, did you bring this up with the team? And he said, yeah, I did. This is something that if I'm UConn, and especially players that were on that team last year and did contribute, they may not have been the number one player, the number two player, but they were on that team and they complemented the Stars to win the national championship. I'm taking that as motivation. And so again, maybe not a great bet at just plus 280, but if I had to just pick one team, I will give UConn the nod there. Moving along to the Big 12. Again, when we talk about deep conferences in college basketball, you can talk to the Big 12 just as much as the Big East. Obviously, Kansas winning the title 2 years ago, Baylor winning the year before that, and Kansas in the COVID year, likely a serious contender for the national championship that year as well. So we move to the Big 12, the addition as well of Houston, one of the top, mid-major level schools over the last few years. They joined the conference. They're right there at the top in the odds. And as we look at those odds for the Big 12, just to get everybody up to speed, Kansas at 2-1, Houston at plus 350, Texas at 5-1, Baylor at 7-1, and then that TCU squad that you spoke highly of earlier at 10-1. Maybe again, just high level overview of what's going on in the Big 12 this year, and I'm going to be turning on a light in the background, so I'll be right back.
Yeah, well, I think when you look at the Big 12, it's no surprise that the Big 12, it's chalk with Kansas. 19 of the last 24 conference championships they've won or had a share of the title. I think they're fairly priced at 2-1. To be honest, I don't think it's a bad place to put your money. Kansas has proved time and time again that the Big 12 runs through Kansas. Looking at Houston, I do think it's surprising. You see them at second plus 350. People are really expecting Kelvin Sampson's going to be able to make that jump. They do get LJ Cryer coming over from Baylor, like we talked about earlier. Plus 350 for them, first year in the Big 12. I think it's a bit overrated just because you're making a step to a new conference. And even if you just take everything out, if you know college basketball, it's the road trips, it's the playing in the new environments. I mean, there's a lot goes into college basketball more than just X's and O's. So I think there might be an adjustment period there. I think some value you can get Baylor at 7-1. Baylor's always going to be competing for conference championship now that they have Scott Drew. Tough place to go and play. They have a great home court advantage. And then you mentioned at TCU at 10-1. I don't think that they're going to beat Kansas in the regular season, but come conference tournament time, I think they could play with anyone. I think they could beat anyone. So it could be a good team to look at later in the year.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier that Kansas State team, somebody interesting to watch in the conference as well. They're about 18-1. Maybe when you look at the Big 12 this year, the addition of Houston, like we said, meaningful. Baylor, every reason to think that they return to that top level of play this year. We know what Kansas is. Maybe a slight drop versus where the Big 12 has been at the just top to bottom over the last few years. Obviously, you would add a few other teams here. Central Florida, not exactly an addition, a positive addition from a standpoint of competitiveness. West Virginia loses Bob Huggins, obviously very controversial offseason there for West Virginia, a team that a perennial contender in the Big 12 and a perennial tournament team that you simply maybe don't expect quite that level from them this year, despite adding some interesting transfers. Oklahoma, Porter Moser hasn't translated the success that he had at Loyola, has he?
No, yeah, and Porter Moser is a guy that I think is going to be interesting to watch. I actually think the state of Oklahoma, you got Mike Boynton and you got Porter Moser. I think those are two coaches that are kind of on the hot seat this year because those programs expect to have success and they have had success, but it just hasn't been there. And it just goes to show, Oklahoma last year's on the bubble of the NCAA tournament with the losing record. The Big 12 is just so difficult to win in. But at the end of the day, if you're not getting it done, I think both those programs have showed that they're not going to be afraid to move on. So those are two coaches that I definitely think are on the hot seat. You talk about the new teams coming in. BYU's one, Cincinnati's another. Good teams, good basketball teams, not teams I think that are going to be making a lot of noise and competing for a championship this year. But again, not going to be easy road trips going to either of those and not going to be surprised if they pick off a team or two. But over the stretch of a 20-game conference season, I don't really see any of the newcomers aside from Houston competing for the Big 12 championship.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think BYU was one that I was going to mention. I think Mark Pope has done a nice job at BYU. It is now his 5th year at BYU. First 2 years at BYU had them as a top 20 KenPom team, which is impressive. They're at BYU, 58th next year and 77th last year. KenPom has them 36th coming into the season. And as you said, never an easy road trip down there in Provo. They've been one of the best rebounding teams in the country. They tend to shoot a high percentage from three. That was an issue for them last year, was a lack of ability from the three-point line. But yeah, will be interesting to watch BYU in the conference this year. And like you said, would not be at all surprising to see them take down one of these top teams in the conference, at least for a win or two, which, again, because of the quality of the conference, a team that may be able to sneak onto the bubble conversations just because they may be able to pick up some quality wins in the conference. Another team I think worth talking about here, projected kind of middle of the road in the conference, is year 3 for TJ Otzelberger at Iowa State. Our boy TJ Otzelberger, assistant coach to Lorenzo Romar, there for a year for our Huskies. I don't think the team was good, but always have rooted for TJ since that moment. They added, I saw, the highest rated recruit in Iowa State history. So a team in the middle of the conference who played well last year. Obviously, Otzelberger's had success now at multiple schools, leading them to the tournament. Any thoughts on Iowa State this year?
I feel like I keep talking about the Big 12 and tough places to play, but that's one of the toughest places to play in the conference and go get a win. Those fans are rabid, and that team feeds off the energy. It's a defensive-minded team. The Otzelbergers really just instilled that toughness and that grit. I think it's fitting for an Iowa State program. I think that their basketball team plays a lot like their football team. They're not going to have the most highly rated guys. They're not going to have all the flash, but you go into Iowa City, that's a tough place to go get a win.
Yeah, 100%. I've attended one game at Iowa State, and the arena, when you walk in, it's unbelievable how big it is. Obviously, we went to University of Washington, Heck Ed, kind of a small, tightly packed arena. It's insane what they've got going on there for the Cyclones.
Correction for my Cyclones, Ames, not Iowa City.
Yes.
Ames, Iowa. Beautiful, beautiful town.
It is. It really is. And then the other team here, one that actually at I guess they're 5-1 to win the conference. Honestly, maybe not as excited as I thought I was going to be there. But Texas, very interesting what Texas did in the portal, bringing in Max Abmas, who at Oral Roberts obviously led them, I think that was 2 years ago, to an interesting run, maybe the Sweet 16 for them. One of the best shooters in the country, one of the best just instant offense, give me the ball, I'm going to find a way to get a bucket player. You combine that with just the pedigree and the depth of Texas and what they're going to bring to the table from a depth of the roster on a year in and year out basis. It doesn't seem like it takes much for them to maybe bump up that next level with this just elite offensive weapon that they are bringing in the second year, or I guess the first full year for Rodney Terry after Chris Beard left in the middle of the season last year. Do you think Texas has an outside shot at contending for the Big 12 title, or is that just too much to ask against Baylor, Kansas, and Houston?
I think I'm lower on Texas than consensus. I think Abrams is amazing coming over from Oral Roberts. I think he can go get you 30 on any given night. But I look at that team and I look at who's going to go score the ball if we commit to taking the ball out of his hands and making someone else beat us. And I just don't know if I see it offensively. On the defensive end, they're extremely athletic. They're going to fly around. They're going to block shots. They're going to get out in transition and run. But when it comes down to the end of the game, if you're going to try to take the ball out of Max Abrams' hands, who's going to be that second guy to step up? At 5-1, I don't love the value there. I think there's some teams further down the list that I'd look at. But again, can understand the hype. Behind Dickinson, he's probably the most exciting, best player to come out of the portal. So I get it. And, Texas, again, it's a tough place to go win a ball game. They've got a great fan base in the new Moody Center. But yeah, I don't see them competing for a conference championship this year.
Yeah, and I think, again, taking the odds out of it and just picking a winner from the Big 12, for me, I'm not going to get crazy with it. It's Kansas. For me, it's Kansas every year. I assume it's the same for you.
Yep, Kansas chalk every time.
Moving on to the Big 10, which I made a note just looking, doing some research over the last few days, and my note for the Big 10 was overall maybe not that great outside of at the very top of the conference. I think it's interesting, but I don't know about the depth of the Big 10 this year. Obviously, it has been one of the deepest conferences in how many teams they get into March now. How those teams have performed in March, it doesn't give you a lot to be excited about from the Big 10. Maybe another reason why, just top to bottom, I'm not that excited past the first couple names of the Big 10. But again, just the high level. What are we on the lookout for in the Big 10? For me, it's Purdue and Michigan State, a clear 1-2 in the Big 10. And I think the only two teams that I'm really excited about here. But how do you feel about the Big 10?
I think you hit it on the head. I think it's a 2-horse race. We've talked about Purdue and Michigan State at the top of the show. Those are the deepest teams, of the most talented teams. Those teams have the most experience. I think it's a 2-horse race. I would probably go with Purdue over Michigan State in conference, and I'd go with Michigan State over Purdue to make a deep run in the tournament, just due to style of play. Purdue's going to play through their big. They're going to play through Edey, and they have very capable guards, but they don't have the guards like Michigan State has that can make some shots late, and I just don't see the tournament run coming from Purdue. Even though fully deserving of being a top team in the country, I just worry come March about the style of play.
Yeah, and I think Purdue – the guard play from Purdue in that opening round loss to Fairleigh Dickinson in the tournament was truly terrible. You're just not going to win, A, the national championship, and B, you're not going to beat many teams in March with that type of play from your guards. to be fair, they pick up some experience this year. You would have to think they'll be improved. We look at the last time, the only other time we saw a 16 seed beat a 1 seed was Virginia. They come back and win the national championship the next year. So there is, I mean, we're talking very limited sample size here, but we have seen a team bounce back from that and ended up going on to win a national championship. But I don't necessarily have the feeling maybe that I did about that Virginia team coming back that I do about this Purdue team. I agree with you. I think they're more than capable of winning the conference again. I think they should be expected to win the conference, but I'm not on the Purdue is going to, overcome what's happened before and go on to win the national championship this year. I think even making the Final Four would be a surprise for me from Purdue. You heard I've listened to interviews with the coach, and he's spoken about needing to figure out a different way, a different style of play almost to be able to adapt to what takes place in March. And I think then when you look at Purdue, an interesting team, obviously, just to watch early in the season, just to see if there maybe is a different style of play that Matt Painter brings to the table for them. We look at their non-conference schedule. They do have that game with Gonzaga that will be down at the Maui Invitational. So we'll get a look at Purdue and what we should expect from them. They obviously played well in the non-conference tournament slate last year. That kind of got them off and running, ultimately then performing excellently in the Big Ten. But as we said, kind of outside those top two teams, Purdue and Michigan State, they'll be in the, hopefully, should be in the national conversation as a top 10, top 15 teams for the whole season. But then we drop down to that next tier. You've got the Illinois, you've got the Maryland and Wisconsin. And I'd put Indiana in there as well as kind of the next four teams in the Big Ten. Any thoughts about those teams, or is there any maybe even further down teams that excite you in the Big Ten?
I'm not sure about excite me, but one team that worries me is Indiana. They lose their top four producers in Hood Schifino, Trace Jackson Davis, Miller Kopp, and Race. Who is
Reese Porter or Reese
Thompson. So they lose their top four producers. They get Xavier Johnson back coming off that foot injury. They hit the portal hard. They got Kel'el Ware coming in, who's an NBA lottery guy. Mike Woodson has produced since he got to Indiana, but looking at this team, I just don't see it coming together for them. I think you think of Indiana, you think of a team that should be competing for conference championships, but this year I just don't really see it happening.
Yeah, and I think some of those other teams that I mentioned there, the Marylands of the world, Maryland, interesting second year for Kevin Willard there. They were fine, solid enough last year. Interesting to see what he does, but at the same time, a coach that always was consistent at Seton Hall, but never necessarily had them as a true threat to do anything deep in the tournament. So I kind of need to see it from him, even at Maryland, to have a lot of faith in them. And then I'd say the same thing about Wisconsin. Wisconsin disappointed last year under Greg Gard. They've been solid. They've had years where they've popped, and they've had years where they've kind of just gotten into the tournament because of the depth of the Big Ten. I think they'll be better this year. Obviously going to play their style of play. They're going to lock you down defensively. It's going to be very difficult to go win games in Madison against them. I think they'll be competitive in the Big Ten, but again, just not a team that you'd expect to do much damage in March. You look at some of the other kind of regular teams that you would expect to be competing in the Big Ten, and probably the reason why we're speaking not too highly about the depth of the conference is you have Michigan and Ohio State, just not with the level of maybe expectations that we would normally have for them.
Yeah, Michigan's down this year. Heck, maybe there's some value on taking Michigan. I don't think to win the conference, but if you can get something to finish top half, they're projected to be a bottom quarter team. Just not what we've come to expect from that program, not what we've come to expect from Beeline, certainly, and not from Juwan Howard. And then looking at Ohio State, I'm not a Chris Holtmann guy. He's put some teams together that have made the tournament, but just not a team that jumps out to me this year that's going to make any noise.
Yeah, and I think so. We don't have to spend a ton of time on the Big Ten. We'll obviously have plenty of time to talk about these conferences throughout the year. But I think we're on the same page where it's, for me, Purdue, the clear choice to win the conference. And then Michigan State would be the team. Like I said, I think they're one of the favorites to win the national championship. And that's just kind of how college basketball works. It's fine to think one team's better, more likely to win the conference, but one team is better set up for March. And I think we're on the same page there in the Big Ten. Moving on to the ACC, another historical powerhouse that maybe doesn't have the depth, similar story to the Big Ten. It is Duke at the top, and like we talked about them a little bit earlier on the show, second year for John Shire, the favorites in the ACC. Thoughts at a high level about the conference and any teams that jump out to you there outside of Duke and North Carolina as interesting in the ACC. Just looking at the odds here, we have Duke at plus 125, actually the biggest favorite out of any of these conferences that we will be talking about today. So a lot of faith in the Blue Devils. And then a drop off to North Carolina, Miami, Virginia, Clemson, Virginia Tech, falling off pretty heavily after that. And of course, we got to give credit to where credit's due with Miami and Jim Larinaga making the Final Four last year.
Yeah, extremely top-heavy conference. Of course, Duke, Filipowski coming back. We talked about the freshmen coming in. UNC got Baycott back, got those transfers coming in. A team I like value-wise is just Virginia. I mean, you're going to give me 7-1 on Tony Bennett. I'll take that almost blindly at this point. They bring back Reese Beekman, the defensive player of the year. They bring in some guys from the transfer portal that people talk about are good on-ball defenders. At 7-1, you know, not going to surprise me at all to see Virginia win the conference. Doesn't mean Duke can't go deeper in the NCAA tournament. You know, Duke might have a higher ceiling, but man, at plus 125, I just don't see the value on Duke. And to be honest with you, looking at those odds, I'd lean UNC over Duke just because UNC, what they do bring back. You know, Armando Baycott's a guy that's been there. He's been in the championship. And he went toe to toe with Paolo Banchero in the Final Four, and they got that win. Again, Harrison Ingram, Cormac Ryan coming over from Stanford, the freshman they bring in, the brand of ball they play. It should be an interesting year for Hubie Brown because you know, you can consider him maybe on the hot seat. You know, if you miss the tournament 2 years in a row with what you were handed, it's kind of like hand the keys to the Porsche, just don't crash it. So we'll have to see how that shakes out. But yeah, I don't know. Plus 125 from Duke. That's heavy odds on.
Yeah. And I think, again, I talked about it earlier. When North Carolina plays Duke, you can kind of throw out the records, throw out who's the favorite there. And if North Carolina can keep it competitive for, again, the bottom half of this conference, nothing to write home about, it could very well come down to those games between Duke and North Carolina. And there's no reason that North Carolina can't win those games just due to the rivalry aspect of what will happen when they play those games later into February and likely in March is usually when they've got those games scheduled. And you mentioned Virginia. They were one earlier when we were talking about national championship odds. I think they're about 60-1. Again, when we just talk about the number of teams that have actually won national championships, the number of coaches that have actually won national championships, Tony Bennett checks that box as a national championship coach. And there's interesting pieces here. Goes to the portal, brings in some interesting additions. And like you said, just the pedigree of them in the ACC. He's going to have them ready for every single opponent. Now they're going to play some close games against teams that they probably shouldn't play close games against just due to the style of play that they have. But our colleague and friend Mike Popper, he went to Virginia. He's a huge Virginia fan, and he's telling me that this is going to be the best on-ball defensive team that Tony Bennett has had at Virginia, and he knows better than I do. And when you tell me that Tony Bennett has one of the best on-ball defensive teams that he's had, I'm going to listen. So, yeah, excited to see what Virginia brings to the table. And at 7-1, just how they've played in the ACC under Tony Bennett, I definitely think that is an interesting bet and probably one of the better values amongst these conference championship level bets. One team, just that when I was thinking about the ACC earlier, that I don't really understand what happened with Florida State. Florida State is a team that has been a perennial contender in the ACC, whether it's in the ACC tournament, always making runs, showing up in March and playing well. They fell off a cliff last year with one of the worst seasons that they've had in a long time. They've gone to the portal and made some big changes. Any of these teams in that kind of range, you know, Florida State is one that I'm going to be watching just early in the season to see, can they get back to that style of play of running 5-10 guys, you know, just rotating them in and out. It's worked so well for them. Didn't work last year. I don't know enough about, excuse me, of the additions that they've made to speak, you know, super highly of Florida State, but just a team that's picked on the lower half of the conference, but has the pedigree and the history of being a top contender in the ACC. Any of these other teams, there's also Syracuse. Obviously, Jim Boeheim has moved along after 47 seasons at Syracuse. There's some interesting storylines at the bottom half of this conference, but do any of these teams jump out to you as ones that you'll be watching maybe early in the season to see if they'll be on the ascendance?
Not Syracuse. They lose Jesse Edwards to West Virginia. They lose Joe Girard to Clemson. On that note, Clemson, a team that you could watch, they play a tough nose brand of basketball. They bring in Joe Girard, who's an absolute bucket. If you watch him at Syracuse, it's a tough place to go play. I think they could be competitive in the conference. Another team I'd just say is Wake Forest and Steve Forbes, one of those mid-major coaches that got his shot at the Power 5 level. And they're competitive. They play an exciting brand of basketball. They play an efficient offensive brand of basketball. They move well. They cut well. They knock down shots. So I think Wake Forest could be a fun team to watch, but I really do think it's a 3-horse race between your Duke, UNC, and Virginia. And not financial advice, but I think if you're looking at Duke at plus 125, take those dollars, put them on Kansas at plus 200. Man, plus 125, that's just got me thrown off a little bit.
Yeah, no, I totally agree that I'd say Kansas is more likely to win, even though a little tougher depth of conference. It's Kansas in the Big 12. What more needs to be said? Can we get a quick statement on Louisville? What's going on at Louisville? What's going on at Louisville?
So I saw that not every poll had them last, so I'm going to go ahead and say they're overrated because they should be dead last in every which poll. They have absolutely no reason to not be dead last coming off of the train wreck of last season. Then they go out and they lose to Kentucky Wesleyan at home in an exhibition game. I mean, this team is an abomination. The Kenny Payne era, like I was so excited for the Kenny Payne era. I thought it was a sick storyline, going to bring them back to competing for national championships, and it's just not happening. So yeah, overrated given that they're not dead last everywhere.
Fair enough. And I'll agree with you. And just note that I didn't even know that Mike Bray had left or was out at Notre Dame. So it is Notre Dame that tends to get that final spot in the rankings. First year under Micah Shrewsbury coming over from Penn State. An interesting move there. But yeah, Notre Dame could be a tough year for them. But I agree with you that disaster at Louisville right now, and we can only hope that there's some light at the end of the tunnel for them at the end of the 2024 season. So going to just again taking the odds out of it, pick for the ACC. I'm actually going to go with North Carolina, even taking the odds out of it. I spoke highly of them at the beginning of the show. It's a risky play because we've seen Hubert Davis in the regular season wasn't good, even the year that they got the 8 seed and made it to the championship. I think, like you said, with some pressure on there and the additions and subtractions also that they've made, North Carolina is going to be my pick in the ACC. How about you?
Yeah, give me the Tar Heels. Give me RJ Davis. Give me Harrison Ingram. Give me Cormac Ryan. And just give me Armando Bacot. I mean, this guy is a walking 20 and 10 when he puts it together. And pair that with RJ Davis handling the ball. You know, potentially some addition by subtraction, taking Caleb Love out. Those two just didn't seem to mesh well last year. Give me the Tar Heels.
All right, there we go. Moving on to the SEC. We're saving the Pac-12 for last year because we will probably have to have an extended Mike Hopkins conversation. So for those not interested in the Washington, and maybe we'll even talk some Husky football because we've got to find a shining light here during that conversation. But before we get there, the SEC, which I have noted the most wide open title race, in my opinion, in the country. You just look at the odds speak to that. The longest odds favorite in any of these conferences that we've talked about or we'll talk about today is Tennessee at 3-1, followed by Kentucky at 4-1, Texas A&M and Buzz Williams, interesting there at 5-1, Arkansas plus 750, Alabama plus 850, Florida 10-1, Auburn 12-1, and then that Mississippi State team that I mentioned earlier at 15-1, and then you've got Chris Beard at Ole Miss at 25-1. We're talking about a conference that at least the odds makers, and when you look at the teams, it makes sense, are telling us that this is one of the most wide open conferences in the country. What's the 30,000-foot view of the SEC this year?
It's going to be competitive and it's going to be fun. You have Tennessee coming in as the favorite. One of those teams that's always top 10 in the KenPom and can't put it together in the tournament. But I think it's fair to have them as the conference favorite coming in. They're a tough regular season team. They've been a tough regular season team. Rick Barnes, an excellent coach. That Tennessee fan base, it's a tough place to go play. And they really have the support of the athletic department there. I think one team that I'm excited about would be Alabama. Again, I talked about earlier, but Grant Nelson coming over. He's going to be, he could be a conference player of the year type guy. And again, just that home court advantage. If Alabama didn't drop one at home, I wouldn't be surprised. One team that I really like is Florida. I like Todd Golding coming over from the University of San Francisco in his second year. I like that brand of basketball that he plays. And a player that I think not a lot of people are talking about is Walter Clayton Jr., the 6'3" point guard who was Iona's point guard last year for Rick Pitino. Rick Pitino raved about the guy going in the tournament. He said he could be the best player in the big dance. Just an absolutely massive pickup for Florida. And I'm really excited to see what they can do this year.
Yeah. And I think it's worthwhile quickly touching on almost a lot of these top teams, just because there is so much parity and depth in the SEC. I tend to think that we will see a Final Four team come out of the SEC this year. You mentioned Tennessee. Last year, another team that I saw, they played here at Madison Square Garden in the Sweet 16, losing to FAU, turned into a slugfest of a game. They were without, is it Vescovi? How do you Santiago?
Santiago Vescovi.
Vescovi. They lose him and struggle down the stretch. They were great for the first half of the season last year. To me, they're going to be as good as any team in the country defensively. But I think you look at a lot of these SEC teams, and defense is the calling card for a good chunk of these teams. They're athletic. They're going to get up and hound you defensively. So for me, it becomes a question of which of these SEC teams is going to be able to score the ball most consistently against this high-level defense. I know you touched on a few teams there, but from an offensive standpoint, are there a couple here that maybe stand out more than the others? Just because, like I said, I think this conference comes down to you're going to get the strong defensive efforts from everybody. And then you're going to get some teams, look at Alabama and Arkansas. Yeah, they score a lot of points, but they don't come about their offensive performance, to set it up in the half court, run some sets and score that way. And I think that has harmed these teams a little bit when they get into March or things like that. For me, the team that ends up winning the SEC is going to be the one who can buckle down and find a way to get buckets offensively against some of this tight defensive pressure. Any that really stand out for you on the offensive side of the ball of these SEC teams?
I think with so many question marks, it brings me to, is this the year that you take Kentucky? They're not the odds-on favorite. Not everyone's talking about them. It seems like every team has question marks. And when you look at that talent, 3 of the top 6 recruits, guys that are going to be in the NBA lottery when they put it together, I think you got to look at Kentucky this year. What are the value? What are the odds on them?
Yeah, Kentucky 4-1, the second choice in the conference there. And then it's Tennessee 3-1, Kentucky 4-1, Texas A&M 5-1. Texas A&M an interesting one. I mean, you have to give credit to Buzz Williams just for everywhere he goes.
Yep,
it's working. I mean, you look at Buzz. Let's just look at what he's done here. Obviously, the success that he had at Marquette, top 25 Ken Palm team almost every single season, goes to Virginia Tech, takes over Virginia Tech as the 175th Ken Palm team his first year. By the time he leaves there in 2019 after a Sweet 16 run, they're the 13th Ken Palm team in the country in 2019. It's a steady progression, 175, 63, 50, 33, 13. So Buzz Williams just proving an ability to build programs and build winning basketball teams. And then he gets to Texas A&M now, where his first couple of seasons, they were not good, 131st and 137th in the country, moving up to 33rd and 33rd the last 2 seasons. And now we get them as the second choice in the SEC this year. And it looks like we've lost Hunter for a second, so I will continue on with the SEC preview while we wait for Hunter to get back online here. He mentioned Florida, another team that I think is interesting. Again, when we just talk about the ability for which of these teams in the SEC is going to bring the offensive side to the table consistently, and it's what Bruce Pearl brings to the table this year for Auburn. They bring back Broome, who is an excellent scorer for them last year. But then they also bring in one of the more interesting freshmen in the country in Aiden Holloway. He's coming over from Napa, California, a point guard, 6 foot, 5-star for Auburn, who joins the Tigers down there this year. So again, just plenty of teams in the SEC who are interesting this year. We see it in the odds with all of these teams tightly clustered. I spoke highly, and we haven't even talked about them in this part about the SEC with Mississippi State earlier in the show as a team that I said at 150 to 1 is interesting for the national championship. Just lots of teams in this conference that are interesting. We haven't necessarily seen the success translate too much over the last few seasons, but I don't think that is something that is unlike it can change this year effectively is what I'm saying there in the SEC. The other top team here in the conference that we haven't spoken about, Arkansas, they pick up some success they pick up a good chunk of players out of the transfer portal. 6, in fact, 6 interesting transfers into Arkansas. So the SEC will be a conference that we'll be watching very closely throughout the season, keeping tabs on everything going on down there in the SEC. It looks like Hunter's slowly working his way back here. We look just quickly further down the conference. Like I mentioned, Chris Beard comes into Ole Miss. And so there's just depth here in the conference. Jerry Stackhouse at Vanderbilt. There's a lot of good stuff going on in the SEC. And welcome back, Hunter. I was quickly flying through. No worries. I kind of just flew through some of those other top teams in the conference. You're back. I'm going to throw you on the spot right out of the gates. Who's the winner of the SEC this year in 2024?
Give me Kentucky.
He's trusting John Calipari. He's going with Kentucky. I'm going to go with... Give me Auburn. Give me Auburn at 12 to 1.
Yep.
Bringing in a top 20 freshman to go with the returning scoring that they have. Bruce Pearl's done a hell of a job down there pretty much every season. I think just when you look at how open this conference is, I feel like it's a good one to take a stab at a team at maybe in the double digits to win the conference. So I will go with Auburn.
I like it.
Back in the nick of time because it's Pac-12 time. Maybe not something that the nation's excited about, but for you and me, like you said, you grew up in Corvallis. I grew up in Seattle, a lifelong Husky fan. We are riding the wave of the University of Washington football team. Won't spend a lot of time on it, but let me note that it is outrageous that the Huskies are not in the top 4 of the college football rankings. When they come out tomorrow, they probably still won't be, but the Washington resume is better than Florida State. And it's honestly better than Michigan, but I'll give Michigan the benefit of the doubt just because of how well they've been playing. But give me Washington ahead of Florida State in the rankings. That's absurd. Anyways, getting into the basketball side of things, you've got right here in our notes, USC appointment television, and we're going to get that tonight at 10:30 against a Kansas State team that we think is interesting. Tell me about USC and maybe the conference at large.
Yeah, USC appointment television, but not for the reason that most people think. Bronny James, they bring in a kid, Isaiah Collier, who has been raved about on the AAU circuit. And they're putting him next to Boogie Ellis. And Boogie Ellis is an NBA level talent. Boogie Ellis is a combo guard that can go and get you a bucket. He's proven that time and time again. Isaiah Collier's best calling card is as a facilitator and what he's able to do constructing the offense and moving the ball. So you put those two together. USC is one of those teams that I look at. I think their odds are a bit long. And I think looking at the conference this year, I don't see why they're behind Arizona when you look at the national championship odds. I think USC, if I had to pick a team, it'd be USC to win the conference this year. Looking at Arizona in the conference, they go out, they bring in international players again. They lose Kerr Kriisa. They got Umar Balu coming back. I mean, Arizona's going to be competitive. If you know anything about Pac-12 basketball, McHale's a tough place to go play. Wouldn't surprise me if they defend home court throughout the season. Not really coming as a surprise at this point, but the Pac-12 seemingly down again this year. But I don't even know if down's the right word to describe it because that's kind of where it's belonged, and that's kind of why it's breaking up. So there's some teams that we can definitely talk about, but if this were a 2 or 3 bid league come March, I would not be surprised.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about the odds in the Pac-12 conference, Arizona the favorite at 2 to 1, USC at 3 to 1, and UCLA at 4 to 1. So those 3 teams clustered at the top, and that's been the Pac-12 largely. Colorado next at 7 to 1. They bring in some interesting players. I guess I wasn't aware, paying attention enough. They bring in the number 4 recruit in the country in Cody Williams to Boulder. Tad Boyles had Colorado as a perennially solid team in the Pac-12. They've made the tournament on a handful of occasions. Always a tough place to play in Boulder, but now they add that elite level talent that you just simply don't see going to Colorado. Now they've developed good players under Tad Boyle, players that end up going to the NBA and playing well, but to bring in a top level recruit like this to Boulder, an interesting year for Colorado. I think there's some higher expectations there than maybe there has been in previous years. And they actually, just looking at the odds, slot in ahead of Oregon, who is the team here who we haven't talked about, who is, probably the one you trust the most if they get to March, just with the success that they have had. Any thoughts on what Tad Boyle has going on there at Colorado and bringing in a top level recruit, what that might mean for the program?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of talk. This could be a year that they get back to the tournament. I think one player that's exceptional is Tristan Da Silva. He's a wing that's athletic. He can score the ball at all 3 levels. If they're to make a run and if they're to get back to the dance, he's going to be a huge piece of it. I don't love their value at 7-1 just because I think USC and UCLA, Arizona are a bit better. If you're looking for value, I think it's going to be on the Oregon Ducks. I mean, can't stand the Ducks as a Husky fan, can't stand the Ducks as a Beaver fan, but Dana Altman can coach, man. He can take your players and beat his, and he can take his players and beat yours. And if you're getting double-digit odds on him to win the Pac-12, I think that's something that you got to look at.
Yeah, I think Dana Altman, to me, we've been to a million Husky games. We've seen all these coaches come through and coach at Hec-Ed, and Dana Altman's the one that I respect the most, just the most impressive coach to me in the conference and what he does on a year in and year out basis. Now, with that being said, a lot of it tends to be in March, and a lot of times maybe with teams that didn't outperform during the regular season. So for me, I think I'd probably pass on them to win the conference, but maybe worth looking in just the national championship odds, or make a Final Four run or something like that, or if you get them to go to the Sweet 16 or something like that, just because I think the way he coaches, kind of building up his team to be ready for that run in March, maybe not quite sharp enough at the beginning of the season. But I agree, just purely looking at the numbers, and when you think of the Pac-12 historically, Oregon's a team that's right up there with Arizona and UCLA. But I think I'm going to play them potentially maybe in a different way, of maybe a Sweet 16 or something like that.
Yeah, he's a coach that tinkers, and oftentimes the guys that start the year aren't the guys that end the year. He's one of those coaches that when you get to the Pac-12 tournament in Vegas, that's where he really shines. He really puts the pieces together. So I like that take, that maybe not your conference championship, but if I'm always someone, when you see him on the 3 or 4 line in the Pac-12 tournament, it's a team that I begrudgingly will put money on.
Yeah, and I just want to quickly jump back to Arizona, because I think what Tommy Lloyd has done in the regular season in his first 2 years at Arizona, coming down from Gonzaga, a coach that was highly sought after, somebody who had been at Gonzaga a reasonable amount of time. I think it was known that he was going to take over a solid job. I think even, as a Husky fan, it was hopeful that we could pull him over to UW. Obviously, he upgrades even much higher than the Washington job, at least as things stand today. Going to Arizona, goes 33-4 in that opening year at Arizona, but does lose in the Sweet 16 to Houston in the NCAA tournament. Comes back last year, another great season, 28-7, but loses in the first round to the Ivy League team, the Princeton Tigers. So he's done it in the regular season, and he's clearly, especially with the type of players that they're bringing in, using the portal, adding Caleb Love, one of the best scorers in the country, player who was excellent on that North Carolina team a couple of years ago. KenPom with them at number 6 to start the year. What do you think should be the expectations for this Arizona team? And in general, maybe just thoughts on Tommy Lloyd and what he's done there over the first couple of seasons.
Yeah, I mean, Tommy Lloyd's an excellent coach. He comes from the Mark Few coaching tree, similar talent and recruiting, where they go overseas and they get a lot of their players. The expectation every year at Arizona is to win the conference and to make a deep run in the tournament. I don't think last year's loss to Princeton should carry as much weight as it might be for some people. Princeton got hot that game. They shut the lights out. And that's just how March Madness goes sometimes. Again, I will say though, if you're looking at Arizona at 2-1, take that money and put it on Kansas at 2-1. I don't think that Arizona's chalk by any means to win this conference. And if you're looking at a bet, I like UCLA at 4-1 more than Arizona at 2-1, just based on what Mick Cronin can do. But I do think Arizona, it's the cream of the crop in the Pac-12. What does that mean? It probably just means that you win your home games and you win most of your road games against bad teams. But I think deserving of the top spot preseason in the Pac-12.
Yeah, and I think what concerns me with Arizona and why they've struggled in March is if you're a team that plays with a top 10, top 20 pace or tempo in the country, I don't care how good you are. I don't care what record you put up in the regular season. I'm not going to believe it come March. The game slows down. The game becomes much more physical. Every possession matters. The pressure builds. What I would hope to see from Arizona, I don't think we're going to see it. I think they're going to stick by their guns and play run and gun, especially you had a player like Caleb Love. He's going to be launching it down there in Tucson. But if, let's say you wanted to bet a future maybe on Arizona to compete for a national championship this year, I would love to see them playing a different style, or at least integrating a different style of play at some point this year, because that run and gun, you're going to burn some teams in the Pac-12 that just can't keep up with that pace. It hasn't worked in March for Tommy Lloyd yet, especially you look at the teams that they lost to. Houston, that's a team who's going to lock you down, play slow, make it difficult. And that's what Princeton's going to do for you as well. Now, obviously, a different level of competition between Princeton and Houston, but the same style of play comes back and bites Arizona. And that is then when you talk about UCLA and Mick Cronin, I think what he's done at UCLA has been fantastic. Taking them, especially, again, we're close to the Pac-12. We saw what UCLA was for a long time, which just wasn't up to the standards I think that they've had. He's the type of coach is almost on the exact flip side of everything that we just said about how Tommy Floyd has been coaching Arizona. UCLA is going to treat every single possession like it's life or death. And I think it kind of ties back to some of the things we've said about the other conferences. Arizona, probably a deserving favorite in the conference this year, just because they are going to boat race some teams with their style of play. Some of these more methodical coaching styles at UCLA, at Oregon. For me, if I was thinking about who's the biggest threat going forward into March, those are the teams that I'd be looking at. And I think you could say the same about USC. Andy Enfield's done a nice job there. He's obviously had some success in the NCAA tournament, but I would look towards a Mick Cronin or look to Oregon for me as the more likely threats come March. And with all that being said, a quick moment to talk about our Washington Huskies. Seemingly an improved roster for Mike Hopkins. For me, the biggest issue for the Huskies under Mike Hopkins has been, let me just pull up the numbers because they tell the story. We look at the Huskies under Mike Hopkins. We look at the assist percentage. And let me read the numbers to you. Since his opening year in Seattle, 329th in assist percentage in the first year, 290th the next year, 184th the year after that, 325th the year after that, 347th the year after that, 288th the year after that. The offensive game planning from Washington, the ISO ball, it's not working, hasn't got the job done. For me, if there's going to be any improvement to the team, it has to start there. They make some interesting additions, though, in the transfer portal. For you, do you see the makeup at least where maybe he's, and then the three-point shooting as well ties into that. So you look at the offensively, the three-point shooting and the assist percentages are terrible. If Washington's going to improve, that has to be the area. Do you see it on the roster this year that maybe he's become aware of that and is addressing those deficiencies?
Yeah, I think you see him trying to address that through the portal. A couple of guys that he goes out and get. First off, you get Keon Brooks coming back. Some NIL there for sure, a NBA level talent guy. But one of those guys that takes a lot of shots off the dribble, takes a lot of long twos, maybe doesn't move it as well as you'd like to see. Takes threes when maybe he shouldn't be. But you go look at the portal, you bring in Severe Wheeler, a player that kind of lit the SEC on fire at Georgia, went to Kentucky, it doesn't work out, now lands at Washington. He's a great point guard. He can pass the ball well, he can knock down shots. So I'm really excited to see him orchestrate the offense. Addressing another big piece of that passing, you go get Paul Mulcahy from Rutgers, 6'6" guy, plays the point forward position. Really hoping that we can see him push the ball up the court more and spread it around. And then you address the shooting, you go get Moses Wood from Portland, and knock down three-point shooter. From everything I'm hearing, he's been shooting it well in practice, shooting it well in the exhibitions. So it seems like he went out and addressed the needs. But one thing you didn't talk about yet, and I'm sure we will talk about, is the 2-3 zone. And everything I'm hearing is that we're ditching the 2-3 zone this year. And I am absolutely ecstatic because since Matisse Thybulle was blocking every shot and sealing every ball at the top of the key, it hasn't worked for this program. I think there's a talent on the defense side of the ball. You look at the bigs, Braxton Mia is an NBA level talent. Frank Kepnon coming off injury. You go and get the big man from Nebraska to transfer. So you have the depth to play man to man this year, and I'm just really hoping that we see it.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about that too, it's if there is, the historical knowledge of that zone defense because Washington's run it since Mike Hopkins has come over. The ability to mix and match the defenses, there's a lot of potential there. You can use the zone, and I think last year, honestly, looking at it statistically, was of the teams that Mike Hopkins has had at Washington since the Matisse Thybulle year, defensively, last year's team was right up there with the best that there has been since that team. So we saw improvement, and it's because of the big guys that are in the paint blocking shots. I think that's a huge piece of it. But yeah, you combine that, and they actually, surprisingly, I think the issue obviously with the zone has been that lots of teams want to shoot the three-pointer now, so you're giving teams shots that they want to shoot. Last year, Washington holding teams to the 13th best three-point, or 13th. They kept teams the 13th worst three-point shooting for the offensive side of things. So there were signs of life last year, 16-16, a couple interesting wins, beat St. Mary's earlier in the year. So I'm excited to see what Washington has in store this year. Open up with Bellarmine. I saw people who maybe know more than me speaking that Washington's got one of the trickier non-conference just against in this first week against some of the kind of mid-level weaker teams. They're definitely going to see a reasonable level of competition. So I think pretty quickly we'll get a sense of what Washington has in store for us this year. They will play Xavier. They will play Gonzaga. So we'll get a chance to judge Mike Hopkins, but obviously on the hot seat when you look at the fact that a new athletic director coming into Washington, a lot of those buyouts that have kept him arguably as the coach in Seattle will be going away after this season. So you've got to think of an NCAA tournament appearance or the end of the road for Mike Hopkins. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's now or never. He came in back-to-back Pac-12 Coach of the Year, takes us to the tournament, win a game against Utah State. But since then, it's been disappointing and it's been frustrating, and it's not been up to the standard of Washington basketball. We're not asking for a Final Four run every year, but we're definitely expecting to be at least in the conversation and making the tournament most years. Because you look at the Seattle talent, and man, if you could just keep those kids home, if you could keep half those kids home, I mean, there's so much talent in the area. And you look at the Brandon Roy years, the Isaiah Thomas years, like this team's done it before, and it has has the facilities to do it. It has the money to do it. It's in a great region to do it. So yeah, if there's no tournament this year, I think it'll be the end of the road for Hopkins.
I agree. And I'm going into the season with very low expectations. I'm going to play it, see how it goes. If we can even win tonight, I'll consider that a success and a step in the right direction. So rounding out the Pac-12, again, take the odds out of it. Give me a winner. I'm going to go with Arizona just because I think, again, the way that they play during the regular season, if they're running and gunning, there's just too many teams that they can steamroll. And I think some of these other teams, maybe UCLA, maybe Colorado, even maybe Oregon, just run into not being able to kind of check off those easy victories in the way that I think Arizona will be able to. I know you're high on USC. Is that ultimately your pick in the conference?
Yeah, give me the Trojans. I'll take that backcourt of Collier and Boogie Ellis. I think they're going to be really exciting to watch.
Yeah, and I think, right now, actually, Oregon tipping off one of the first games of the season up 51-40 on Georgia. Georgia, not a team that, anybody's going to be super high on in the SEC, but I think if Oregon can hold on here and pick up opening season victory, just a solid start for the conference, a solid start for Oregon, picking up a win over an SEC opponent. It looks like Dante has 10 points and 13 rebounds for Oregon. And so, yeah, those are just the type of players. And as we were talking about earlier, the pedigree at Oregon and what they do on a season-by-season basis, I think they'll be interesting come the end of the season. I wouldn't be surprised at all to see Dana Altman with the Ducks in a Sweet 16 come March, but ultimately I'll go with Arizona in the conference here. Tying things up, like I said, tomorrow we'll be back to touch on the mid-majors, talk about the teams that are interesting there. I think there's obviously some interesting storylines at that level. But quickly before signing off here, maybe just touch on, speaking of USC, what is the game of the night tonight? USC versus Kansas State in Vegas. There's that 2.5, I believe USC minus 2.5. I think this a very interesting game, and there's not a ton of interesting games in the first few days of the season, but this is one I'm definitely excited about. How about you?
Yeah, I'm excited to watch this game tonight. Good measuring stick game. I'll be on USC minus 2.5. I just think it speaks to, I know what USC is going to give me, and I'm excited to see Collier and Boogie Ellis together. I don't know what Kansas State's going to be running out there, but yeah, it does scare me to bet against Jerome Tang. And I think it's, I could see why someone would be excited to take them with the points, but give me USC, give me Andy Enfield tonight.
Yeah, and then even just looking, we'll be back probably on Thursday with our next podcast to preview on what Friday should be. Just a great set of games, a ton of about 12 top 100 matchups there on Friday. But just looking ahead to the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday games. On Tuesday, a team that I was, when we lost you there for a second, I was speaking highly of is Bruce Pearl's Auburn team this year. You spoke highly about Baylor, and we get them in Sioux Falls tomorrow night. Auburn versus Baylor. That's an exciting one. And then we move on to Wednesday. Nothing much to write home about in the Wednesday session. We do get Arizona State versus Mississippi State up in Chicago. And we also get to see Florida Atlantic. We'll be talking mid-majors tomorrow, but they'll play Loyola Chicago in a matchup of some interesting mid-majors over the last couple of years. Those are obviously teams that have made extended runs in recent years. And then on Thursday, not a ton to be excited about here either. There's New Mexico, who I'm sure we'll talk about tomorrow, getting a lot of hype. I've saw multiple Final Four selections for the Lobos, which I thought was interesting. So we can touch on that tomorrow. They'll play St. Mary's, who, as we said, actually favored for some people in the WCC this year before Friday, where things really kick off. Any of those games or anything else to add here in the first few days of the season that you'll be watching?
Definitely that Baylor Auburn game. I think that'll be exciting to see. I'll be on Baylor in that game, but I see why you like Auburn. Bruce Pearl always going to play an exciting brand of basketball, so always happy to tune into a game like that.
Yeah, give me the over. Yeah, I don't know what it is yet in the Auburn Baylor game. Early season, Bruce Pearl is going to be letting them fly. He wants to see who's got it going offensively. Baylor's going to be getting up and down the floor. If I could see both teams getting 80, 90, 100 points in that game. So give me the over there. But yeah, so we'll be back tomorrow night. We'll be talking mid-majors, and then we'll be back throughout the rest of the season talking college basketball once we actually have some numbers, some data to go off of. And we will have those numbers. We'll have that data up on the Vinceric site. We've got a lot of exciting things there. We'll obviously be talking about that on the podcast. Maybe we can screen share, walk through some of the stuff that we're doing there. We look forward to launching a new sport. We obviously appreciate all the support we've had in golf since we started there. We're also really excited for golf season to get going again. We've got some big things coming in January there, but our focus for the next couple of months on college basketball. Before we sign off, the simple question for anybody the day before, the day of the season: who's your Final Four and who is your national champion preseason prediction?
I'm going to go with Creighton, USC, Michigan State, and Kansas. And I will take Kansas to win it all. I know it's chalky, but give me Kansas.
Fair enough. I think I will go Kansas. I will go Michigan State. I will go Duke. And I will go with, I know I've been high on them, so I think I have to choose them. Let's get another Duke, North Carolina Final Four going. We didn't get it for the longest. We didn't get them in the tournament forever, but why not give it to us a couple times in a few years? So that is a blue blood chalky Final Four for sure. And I'm going to go with Michigan State. I've lost plenty of money and credibility supporting the Big Ten in the tournament. Last year, Purdue obviously blowing it. But if there's one team that you can at least have some faith in, it's been obviously a long time since they won a championship. It is Tom Izzo. It is Michigan State. I'm going to say that this is the year that the drought ends in the Big Ten. I get kind of a safety blanket with that. Also means that I'm kind of on Purdue. I don't think they're actually going to win, but I can say the Big Ten drought ends, and at least I've got two legitimate contenders. But give me Michigan State to win the national championship in 2024. Hunter, appreciate it. Look forward to chatting basketball this season. For everybody out there, follow us, Vincerix_hoops on Twitter. Subscribe on YouTube. That's at Vincerix. And then you can find this podcast up on Vincerix Hoops. I know there's some people who will watch on Twitter and then they'll be like, it's much easier, obviously, to click around and do other stuff listening when you listen on the podcast sites or even on YouTube as well. So check us out there. And we look forward to a great college basketball season. Thanks, everyone.